host, Dr. Deb, and this is a place where we talk about all sorts of things in terms of psychology, both research based and clinical based. Today, we are going to talk more about generational trauma, and that is because one of my viewers requested more information. So, today I'm going to be talking about three more types or aspects of generational trauma. The first one has to do with family traditions. The second one is sort of related to that in that we will begin looking more at about secrets and the roles people take based on family secrets. And the third area is the types of behaviors people learn when they grow up in a family that has generational trauma and how that can affect the person. Now, starting with the first one, uh, in terms of family traditions, most families have certain traditions, whether it's what church one goes to, what kinds of meals one has on holidays, all sorts of different kinds of traditions. And frequently, as we grow up, we just know that's what we do. For example, there was a story that was told in one training I went to about a little girl who was watching her mother make a roast. And the mother took this nice big piece of meat, sliced off part of it, and put it in the pan. And there was a lot of space around in the pan, uh, but that's how the mother had always done it. And so the mother put the pan in the oven, and then she took the piece that she had cut off and fried it up for sandwiches. And the little girl said to her mother, "Why do you cut off that piece of meat?" And the mother said, "Well, that's what we've always done. That's what my mother did. That's what your grandmother did. Uh, but if you have a question about it, go talk to your grandmother." So the little girl went off to find her grandmother, who was in the living room reading and getting ready, thinking about what she was going to do as part of her, uh, what she was going to do in terms of adding to the dinner. So the little girl said, "Grandma, why do we cut off a piece of meat when we put, before we put the roast in the oven?" And the grandmother said, "I'm not really sure, but that's how my mother always did it. And your great grandmother is coming over a little bit later, and we're bringing her over. So why don't you ask her?" And so the great grandmother was brought over by some relatives, and the little girl went up to her and said, "Can you tell me why we cut off a piece of meat off the roast before we cook it?" And the great grandmother looked at her and she said, "Well, it's because when I was a young housewife or wife, I had only one size. We weren't very wealthy, and we only had one size of pan. And I went out to buy a roast, and it was a little bit too large for the pan, so I cut it off. And that's what I did. And the thing is, I always had that pan. I tended to always get a roast that was a little bit too big, so we would have sandwiches from the part that I cut off, and that's what I would always do." And so the little girl said, I see. That's how our family does it. Now you can see that the little girl's mother didn't really understand why her grandmother did it the way she did, but that's how the tradition had come down. Now, how does this have to do with generational trauma? Well, there are some cultures, some families where part of the family culture and tradition includes certain kinds of trauma, whether it's beating children who misbehave with um, a razor strop or a paddle or something like that, which can cause trauma to the child, or some families where incest is acceptable. So those sorts of family traditions can result in traumatic upbringings of children. Now, you can also think of families that it is acceptable for behaviors such as abuse, whether it's emotional or physical. Those can be part of family traditions. Now, how does that spiral into talking about family secrets and roles? Well, sometimes families who have these kinds of traditions realize that the rest of their surrounding culture, society, uh, do not accept those kinds of behaviors. And so, yes, those behaviors happen, but everyone in the family is told, we don't talk about that. That's our business, not their business. You don't air your dirty laundry. And so what happens, it becomes a secret. And these things may not be spoken about directly. There may be some implied information, sort of code words, phrases that the family members may use. And often the children won't understand what these phrases and code words mean until they're older. So the family conveys information about their secrets. And sometimes these secrets become so muddied that it's almost like playing a game of telephone. You know something was there to begin with, but you don't really know what it is. It's just that it still has an effect on you and your descendants. Now, part of that can have what that can cause is people taking certain kinds of roles within the secret. For example, say a family has the secret of once back before this Civil War being slave owning family, but they don't in the present day they don't want people to know about it. In fact, the younger generations might not even really know. They know that they lived in the South, but they don't really know anything about it. But there might be some hints in the words that the older generations say that make some of the younger generations feel as though they need to be more active in certain ways in terms of civil rights, or may go back the other direction and be more of a persecutor. But again, those people may not really know why they are taking on the roles that they are taking on because of all of this hidden information. Unless they become more aware and start looking to see why they are thinking the way they are and acting the way they are. They're becoming more aware. Now, that actually brings us to the third area in which I was going to speak, which is learning certain behaviors that come from your ancestors' past trauma. Now, if you remember, if you watched my video about how narcissism can develop, it's a combination of a sort of sensitive nervous system with abandonment or some kind of unattachment occurring with a child between about the ages of 5 to 13, that can result in narcissism. Now, if you have a narcissistic parent, or even a grandparent, but a narcissistic caregiver who's interacting with a child, where do children learn their behaviors? They learn them from their caregivers. Uh, when they're older, they will learn them from their peers, but when a child is really young, where they learn their behaviors are within their family structure. And very often, the primary conveyor of those behaviors is going to be the main caregiver. So, say you have a narcissistic mother. It could be a father, but in this day and age, usually the mother is the primary caregiver. And say this mother had a terrible childhood and developed certain narcissistic behaviors. That young child will model him or herself after the caregiver and thus will respond as though he or she is a narcissist without necessarily going through that process to become a narcissist. And you can actually see this in generations. It may have been 4 or 5 generations earlier where the uh, abandonment problem happened, producing someone who is basically reflecting narcissistic thought patterns. That person then raises a child who then also takes on those kinds of behaviors and potentially some of the thought patterns, but mostly the behaviors. And then that person has a child and so on. And so you get a family line of people behaving as a narcissist without necessarily having the same thought processes. They may have some because we all have a certain amount of narcissism. If we didn't, for example, I wouldn't be doing this. So um, that's how those patterns can occur. And I once had a client whose husband actually realized that his mother was a narcissist and that he had learned a lot of behavior patterns that he realized were detrimental to his relationship with his wife and his children because they reflected that kind of way of being in the world. And so he was very aware. And so he was doing things to try to change himself uh, with input from his spouse. And he was on his own journey. He was seeing his own therapist to address these sorts of issues. But the important thing is becoming aware of one's patterns and figuring out where those patterns came from. I mean, if you've got a behavioral pattern that's working fine for you, you've got thoughts that are working for you, then there you can be aware of that and realize you don't necessarily need to change it. But if these patterns are getting in the way of your life and your happiness, well, that's a reason to begin to address it yourself. In fact, in my next episode, I'm going to be starting to talk about how, as a therapist, I would help people with their different kinds of trauma. And there are a whole lot of different approaches. Now, to segue to our next area, remember I've been talking about different ways to help with anxiety and depression and sleep issues. And I talked about cranial electrotherapy stimulation, CES, which is what the Soda Biotuner does, and the Fisher Wallace product, uh, and also how they affect brain waves. Well, today I'm going to talk about another device. You can see I like devices, called a Mindwave machine. And with the other uh, machines, like the Biotuner and the Fisher Wallace device, they are preset to affect your brain waves at a certain output. They have a couple of things you can change, but it's pretty set. Now, this Mindwave machine, I will hold it up. If you can see it, I know everything's reversed, but it has different levels, and depending on the level you select, up here, you can select where alpha, beta, delta, subdelta, um, and all the specific brain waves you might want to have. There's a timer, a strength indicator, and it's pretty straightforward. It takes it takes a 9-volt battery, and it clips onto the ears the same way as the Soda Biotuner does. Little clippies. You turn it on, and it will cause a little teeny electrical wave shock. Well, it's not a shock, a little teeny electrical impulse to go from one ear to the other ear, and it will cause your brain to vibrate at the level that the brainwave uh, indicator you have selected. And it can, if you select alpha wave, it will help calm your brain. Excuse me, excuse me again. Will calm your mind. If you set it at beta, it will help with uh, problem processing and things like that. Theta with deep meditation. So it's a very useful little device for those kinds of situations. Now, next week or the next time I make an episode, we'll continue talking about ways to address anxiety and depression and sleep, focusing more on meditation and tools to help one learn how to meditate. And so uh, that's what's going to come next. So I'm going to be not available, or I will be out of town for a couple of weeks. So expect the next episode to be in about 2 weeks. But in the meantime, if you have questions, leave them in the comments and I will address them. If you have topics you want to see me touch upon, or address, leave those also in the comments. If you have found this information to be helpful for you or your family or anyone you know, please like it and subscribe and share it around, because the more people who understand this information, I think the better it is for them as they move forward in their lives. So thank you, and I will see you in a couple of weeks.